Okay, time for some audience participation. So, did you know that if you watch something horrible, like a child being raped, like someone desperately in need of help who's crying out and no one's responding, if you watch something like that and you don't respond, that you are systematically desensitizing your own body to a point where the way you experience it, when it starts happening to people around you, possibly even your own family, is that it's not a big deal, that your own family is being abused. And the way it works is it's a little bit like a phobia. Not all phobias are bad. Snakes have traditionally been very toxic to us as human beings, and so we have a reaction. But you can create an exposure, a systematic exposure, where if you expose someone about 15 times to a phobia, it stops becoming such a big deal. Now, this is one of the reasons I stopped watching the news. And here's a little experiment. How many of you think watching the news is important? And how many people think that watching the news is crazy? So, how many of you do watch the news at least once a week? How many of you watch the news once a day? And how many of you can remember taking a single action to help someone as a result of watching the news? So let's go around the audience. Anyone at all taken a single action to help someone as a result of watching the news? How about something in the last 12 months? How many people have done a specific thing to help someone in response to watching the news? Now, this could mean you heard about a disaster and you got up and donated because you saw something on the news. It could mean you picked up and called a friend and said, could we help, with this place or that place as a result of watching the news? So how many of you have done that once in the last year? How many of you have done that once in the last month? What I realized for myself, and for me personally, and first of all, what does this mean? Meaning, every time you hear about something horrific that's going on that you do nothing about other than take another bite of the sandwich, the message we give ourselves is that trauma is no big deal, that it's not something to respond to. Now, this is a very confusing message. It's a little bit crazy-making because at some level we know that if it could happen to them, there are certain circumstances when it could happen to us. We also understand that to some extent, if we don't care about them, we're not caring about us. And we understand that if we are the kind of person who doesn't respond when someone else needs help, we understand innately that we live in a world that doesn't respond to people who need help. The brain is an incredible synthesizer of integrity. It says, you're a human being, I'm a human being. The way you get treated is similar to how I get treated. If you're worth this amount, then I'm worth this amount. Now, we spin it differently. We have different compartmentalization. So we say, no. See, I've got more money than you, so it's fine that your daughter gets raped, but no. My daughter is not going to get raped because I get all this money. Or, yeah, it's fine that these people over here, but people in my country. But obviously, if this was, incredibly strong, we wouldn't be seeing chronic homelessness in one of the fifth wealthiest counties in the United States, would we? Because, how insular do you have to get? Like, nobody's homeless inside my house. So, but if there was anyone homeless inside my house, I would do something immediately. But, they're not in my house. They're, a few doors away. They're out on the street, and so I'm not responding. Now, the reason I stopped watching the news was not because the news is bad objectively, but everything's relative. And the first thing I had to say was that I can't remember a single time when I've gotten up off the sofa and done something useful as a result of the news. In other words, it wasn't news that was relevant to my behavior in my eyes. Well, then the question is, if it's not relevant to my behavior, because I'm not doing anything different as a result of digesting the information, what am I doing spending 30 minutes a day or 3.5 hours a week or more than 150 hours a year? What am I doing spending 150 hours of my year watching something that raises adrenaline, numbs me, leaves me with the message that other people's things are no big deal, other people's problems are no big deal, when I could be doing a lot of other things with that 150 hours of time? I learned, for example, that I could write and self-publish a small book on something useful in 150 hours a year. So I started doing that. But the other thing I did was I switched my attention to media, meaning I've digested, how many of you use Audible? Okay, I do. How many of you notice that your constructive media consumption went up over just reading books when you started using Audible? You see, at the time that and for how many of you did your useful media consumption double or triple or more as a result of using Audible? Mine went up more than 50 times. Because I was reading 1 to 2 books a year at the time I came across Audible. And I started reading 50 to 100 books on Audible, because you can listen to it cooking and driving and hot tubbing and going for walks. And so, Audible and media consumption just took off. And it was really useful stuff. I spent $5,000 on Audible, and that's 500 books. When you buy 20 or more, when you're in that group in Audible, every unabridged book on the entire platform is 1 credit, and every credit costs $9.98. So 500 books, $5,000. Those $5,000 have already made me $200,000. And have generated more free time than it costs to listen to them. And there's a lot of great useful information, some of which show up in this project. So, great investment. Now, one of the reasons that the news is very popular, even though it's hard to call it news, and you learn this when you travel. I listen to the BBC and listen to CBC, so I've lived in United Kingdom and Canada and America, and even world news is different in different countries. And you realize, well, that can't be. Well, why am I not hearing anything about? You can tune in a shortwave radio and listen to the 3 newses, and you'll find all kinds of different newses about the world. And it's the same world. So you realize it's not really the news. It's, every media organization has its little filter that's hard to figure out exactly why this is news on the BBC and this is news in America and this is news in Canada when it's world news. Hard to find out, but it's pretty arbitrary at some level. And it could be going on constantly. You could have 24/7 news, or it could be 1-minute news. It's, again, rather an arbitrary length. You're never going to know all that's going on in the world. And so what I've tried to focus on is stuff that's relevant to something I'm going to take action of a constructive nature about today. That's news. Everything else, not so much.